Hey everyone, and welcome to today's video where we're going to be doing our first project of our React course. Now this project is going to be pretty simple, but we're going to use everything that we've learned up until this point. Then we're going to go ahead and introduce more React concepts, things like Redux, and then we're going to make another project using all of those things. So it's going to be pretty exciting, and I'm really excited for this video. I hope that the code is zoomed in enough and I have everything prepared for you. So if you find value in this video, please consider leaving a comment, liking, or subscribing. And yeah, I just read every single comment and I love interacting with you guys. So let's just jump straight into it. The application we're going to make today is going to use a very simple public API from a website called jasonplaceholder.typeco.com, and essentially they pretty much just have a bunch of fake endpoints that you can hit, and we're going to hit one that we've hit in a previous video called the todos endpoint. So in this todos endpoint, if you just hit the regular endpoint, you just get a list of a ton of different to-dos, 200 of them. And then if I wanted to get the information for a certain to-do, I would do a slash. For example, let's say if I wanted to get the information for to-do number 6, I would write /6, and I would just get the information for that to-do. Now you'll notice the information is the same, but we're going to pretend that by hitting this endpoint where you are passing in an ID, you are actually getting more information just for the purposes of our example. Now the way our application is going to work is we're essentially just going to have two main screens. We're going to have just a slash endpoint, and that slash endpoint is just going to show a list of all the to-dos. So you know, maybe individually, just all the different to-dos here, all the way down to 200. And then when you click on one of these to-dos, it will go to slash on our browser, to-dos, and then the ID. And from there, we are going to make an API call that is going to get the information for just that specific to-do, and we will display that specific to-do. So two API calls being called here. The first one on the main page, we're just calling the to-dos that gets the whole list of to-dos, this endpoint right here. And then once we get to this page, we are calling the to-do with the ID, so we get the information for that specific to-do. And inside of this, we're going to be using things like conditionals. We're going to be using the map functions we talked about, React router, and all that good stuff that we've learned up until this point. So let's just start coding. So over here I have my code sandbox, and obviously this is going to be public. I'm going to have this in the description of the video so you can see the full result. You can fork it and make your own version of it and play around with it. And let's go ahead and install some dependencies. The first thing we want to install is React router, that we're going to need to use it. So the React router project library, is react-router-dom. So if you're following along on VS Code and you're using create React app and stuff like that, in your terminal you can go ahead and type npm I react router dom, and that'll go ahead and add it to your package.json. On code sandbox you don't have to do that, so I can go ahead and type in react router dom, and just click it, and it'll automatically install it for me here. Let's also go ahead and install Axios, which is the library we are going to use to make the API request, the GET request to that fake API that we looked at. Let's go ahead and get that. We can also go ahead and install Material UI. We're not going to style this application, and Material UI is a library that is used to style React applications. And if you're interested in that, I have a whole 31 video series on how to use Material UI with React. Highly recommend going through that once you learn the basics of React, to learn how to start and style your application to look absolutely amazing. We're going to install that because I'm going to use tiny little elements here and there from Material UI, but we're not going to go too crazy, and we're not going to go and style every single portion of this application. In fact, if you want, that could also be some sort of homework that after the video is done, you go ahead and try styling it yourself using some of these things from Material UI. But we're just going to use some tiny components from the Material UI library. So I think that's all we need for now. If we're missing anything else, we can install it as we go. But let's go ahead and start structuring this application. The way I want my application to be structured is I'm going to have all the routing stuff in my app, and then I'm going to make a new component for each one of these pages. And then if I need any other pages, For example, if I want to make these individual little to-do cards into their own components, I'm just going to make a new file for that as well. So the first thing I like to do is to just start off with the routing. So I'm going to make one file for the for our routing, and that will represent, you know, this page. That's gonna, and let's call that like to-dos, or yeah, let's call it like todos.jsx. Then I'm going to make another file, and that one's going to be for the individual page. So I'm going to call that todo.jsx. And then finally, I'm going to make, actually, before I even make the to-do cards, let's just go ahead and make these ones. So just to make sure that routing is done fine, what I like to do is with each one of these individual components, I'm just going to create a regular component, you know, const to-dos, I'm just going to return some placeholder JSX, something like this is the to-dos component. Okay. Export default to-dos. And this, I'm just going to make it, you know, I'm going to copy this and do it for to-dos as well. And I'm just making this so that when I set up the routing, I can test to make sure that the routing is done properly. So now I'm going to come back to my app once I have these two components made. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to delete all this boilerplate stuff. I'll leave the class name equals app stuff because it centers everything nicely and I don't want to rewrite the CSS for that. But what I'm now going to do is I'm going to start making our routing. So if you remember, for routing we use React Router, and I'm going to just go ahead and copy an example from their documentation. It's pretty much the exact same as what we saw in our previous video. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to import all this stuff. For this, we're only going to need these imports, so our router, which is our provider, our switch statement, which will allow us to determine where we want different routes to go, and obviously just our regular routes. So we can go ahead and import that. And now in here, let's go ahead and add our braces back in. I'm just going to set up our route, our router. And now I can nest everything else inside of it once I have our router set up. And essentially all we're really going to do is set up a switch statement. Oops. So our switch statements, we're going to have two routes inside there. Number one is going to be the route that just matches with slash. So this slash is going to be our quote homepage, and when we're on our homepage, we want to just show the list of all the to-dos. So I'm going to import and display the to-do page. So import to-dos from /to-dos, and I'll go ahead and add that here. And now a cool thing that we're going to look at is we want to actually pass in. Let's go ahead and save that. So formats, we want to pass in an ID with the to-dos pass. So I'm going to pass in to-dos slash and then colon ID. What this does for React Router is we are telling that is going to be a parameter that we want to access inside of the actual component that we're going to be displaying. And in this case, the component we're going to be displaying is to-do. And that ID can be anything. Ideally, it's going to be a number that correlates with our to-do. But when you have a colon here and then a name of a variable, that means that it will match to-do slash and then anything that comes after it and passes in that ID that comes after it as a variable into our to-do component. So let's see. It looks like we're having an error. So, I accidentally imported uppercase React, I think, over here. Let's go ahead and move that to lowercase React. There we go. So we can see we're on just slash. Let me see if I can. It's going to be hard to zoom this in, but we're on the application and then just slash, and it's saying this is the to-dos component. Maybe I'll change the text to be a bit bigger so it's easier to at least read the text. So I'm going to change those from paragraph tags to H1 tags. The URL isn't as important to see because I'll just tell you what the URL is. And you can see it says this is the to-dos component. And then if I go to /to-dos/ And you know what? It might even make sense to change this to slash to do because it's an individual to do. If I go to slash to do slash, 1, for example, you'll see we are on the to do component now. And let's see how it works when we want to actually get that ID, because we're going to need that ID to call the API. So let's, go in our to do things. And in order to actually get that ID, we can use a function, a React hook that comes with the React Router DOM called useParams. So I'm going to go ahead and import useParams into our to-do component. We can get rid of all this. We're just going to keep the useParams function. And to use the useParams function, it's quite simple. We just go ahead and we declare our variable and we destructure it from the useParams hook. So in our case, if we go back to the app, we can see here that the param variable I'm passing in is one called ID because we want to get the to-do ID. I can go back to my to-do component and go ahead and let the ID, since this doesn't change, I think you just set that to const. You can change that so const ID is equal to, we're destructuring it from useParams. And now what we can do is in our return, let's say for example, I can be like, say something like, this is the to-do component and the to-do ID is, and then pass in the ID. And you can see here, I'm now getting the to-do ID is 1 because I have 1 after the URL. And if I had, like 30,000, it would pass in 30,000. So this is a cool way to get a variable from the actual URL parameter. And when we have to-dos equal to 1 and we go to to-dos equal to 2, we want to be able to see that the to-do is changing based on that. And in order to do that, we need the ID. So this is a really good start that we have going on here. Now that we have the routing pretty much set up, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to work on getting the data. And in order to get that data, we are going to use our useEffect. And specifically, we want these useEffects to run as soon as the component is rendered. So we're going to go ahead and import useEffect. So we're going to destructure useEffect from the import useEffect from React. And now what we can do is we can go ahead and use it. So the first thing we're going to do is type in useEffect, and we're going to create our useEffect. So if you don't remember from my previous video, we actually looked at making an API request with the useEffect hook. And if I can pull up the code right here, you will see this is the code that we used to do it. I'm quickly going to copy that and paste it into our application. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we are doing. So the first thing that's happening here is, and let me go ahead and minimize this stuff so you can see the code a bit better. The first thing we're doing is we have a useEffect, and within this useEffect we are essentially passing in an empty array at the end, which means this useEffect is going to only run as soon as the component is mounted, the first time that it is mounted, and if it gets mounted again, or let's say for example the component refreshes while it's already mounted, it will not run this again. And the reason we want this is because we only want to fetch all the data the first time that we are actually rendering the component. And if something else like a state variable were to change that component, we don't want to have to re-render it over and over and over again, which is why we want a useEffect that only runs right when the component first gets mounted. The second thing you can see is here is inside of our useEffect, we are calling Axios. Let's go ahead and import Axios. We installed that dependency at the beginning of the video. And Axios is just a library that allows us to make API requests, and it will make it'll allow you to make a post request to anywhere that you want type of thing. And you can see here we have the URL set in here already. And the next thing it does is we have a .then function, which is pretty much something that allows you to synchronously wait for a call to finish. And then in the .then function, you can do whatever you want after it's called. So you can see here, the first thing we do is we get the, the to-dos in our response variable, and then from the response.data. And then what we're doing is we are calling this function called setTodos. Now, what this function is going to be doing is our to-dos is actually inside of a state variable. So let's go ahead and import the useState variable from React. And now what we're going to do is we're going to create a state variable, and that state variable is going to be responsible for holding all of the to-dos. So I'm going to go ahead and say const, and I'm going to say to-dos, and I'm going to get the setter method for it. So it'll be called set to-dos equals React use state. And we're going to go ahead and we can initialize this to perhaps be undefined. So we're just going to initialize it like that. And now if we were to go ahead and let's go back to the slash, you can see here it says this is the to-dos component. If we were to go ahead and console.log our to-dos variable and open the console up here, it might be a bit small, but you can see here, if I go ahead and refresh this, the first time it renders, it is undefined. Because this console log will run before this get request actually finishes. And I know this might be a bit small, but it's just two things. And the first one is that it renders undefined because it's going to be rendering before this actually, the Axios request actually completes. But the second time we get an array of 200 objects, and those are all our to-dos. So that's all you really need to know for the console part of it. I'll go ahead and minimize that as well. And I'm explaining all this because I really I know I get a lot of comments that sometimes like different things on the screen are a bit too hard to read and the font size might be a bit too small, which is why I'm a bit conscious about the font size stuff. But yeah, so now what's happening is every time we go to slash in our application, we get routed to this to-dos component. And this to-dos component is making an API request, and that API request is going to go ahead and get all of this data from all of this API, all 200 of these different to-dos. Now, let's have a bit of some cool rendering tricks over here. So what I can do here, for example, is let's go ahead and get rid of this H1 stuff. Let's make some React fragment self-closing tags so we can add some stuff in here. Now, what I want to happen is while it is loading the data, while the data is still undefined, I want it to show a little loading animation. And we can import that loading animation from Material UI, which is why I wanted to import Material UI in the first place. So what I can do is import, and I think it's called circular. Let me go ahead and try importing it and see if it'll automatically import. I can't remember the exact component name. I think it's circular progress. There we go. So we are going to go ahead and import circular progress from Material UI. And let's go ahead and just display circular progress for you guys to see what it is. All it is, I'll zoom in really quick, it's just this little loading bar thing. So it'll just show like a little loading animation, and that might look familiar to you. You might see it on Android phones a lot, and that's because Material UI is commonly used in a lot of Google applications. It's actually what Google does use, so that's why you might see it in a lot of Android related stuff. So that's what that looks like. So we can go ahead and in circular progress, so we want to show this whenever our to-dos variable is undefined. So what we can do is we can have a ternary function, and we can go ahead and say to-dos question mark, and this is what will and colon. So the thing after the question mark is what will render if to-dos are, you know, present, if it's not undefined, and then everything after the colon is what it will render if it is not. So I can just put some JSX here that says like to-dos have been loaded, just for display purposes. And you'll see here it says to-dos have been loaded. If I refresh it, you might barely see for a split second. I guess I guess it loads the data a bit too fast for you to see the loading bar. But it will, if let's say, for example, you're on a bit slower internet, or for some reason the API is taking a bit of time to respond, you will see that whenever it's actually loading and making the API request, the circular progress shows and it'll load. So I'm going to go ahead and let's start building out what we want to show in the case that the to-dos are actually loaded. So let's go ahead and add some braces around here. And what we're going to do is we want to essentially display a bunch of stuff about the to-do. We want to essentially display like a bit of a to-do card. So let's go ahead and make div, And what we're going to do here is we can go ahead and, for example, like we can map through the to-dos. So todos.map, and then each to-do will be a result of that. And we can go ahead and just structure, let's say, what information we want out of that to-do. So, for example, oh, I forgot to put my curly braces around here. Okay, so for example, in the data, we are getting all of this data back for each to-do. We're getting the user ID, the title, and whether it's completed. So let's just go ahead and import the title and whether it's completed for this very simple view. So I'm gonna destructure title and completed from the to-do. And I'm gonna go ahead and return just, you know, maybe a div. And inside of there, I'm going to display, you know, in like H4, maybe the title. And then in H6, let's say completed. Okay. So now we can go ahead and see here. Oops, and I should probably wrap those in squiggly braces so that it displays the actual variable and not the thing itself. Okay, so I'm going to change this to... Right, so did I call completed properly? Okay, so it looks like, let's go ahead and do some string interpolation for the completed variable. Because I think it's rendering to false, so there we go. So now we can see if it's completed or not for all this example. So you can see here we have the title of the to-do, and it's just displaying them in a giant list format. We have the title of the to-do and the completed being false. But I want to style this and make this a bit better. So what I actually want to do is I want to create a different component to handle all of this logic, because I know I'm going to be adding more stuff to this to sort of style it and make it look better. I think my code would be a lot cleaner if in this to-dos map I just called another component that did all of this instead. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new file, and I'm going to call that file to-do card.jsx. In that to-do card, let's go ahead and, you know, import React from React. Let's go ahead and say, you know, const to do card equals, and we're going to pass in a prop here that's going to be called to do, which is where we're going to get all the to do information from. And let's go ahead and export default to do card. Now in here, I'm probably just going to want to do what I did in that file. I'm going to go ahead and cut all of this stuff, and I'm going to paste it into this file. So I'm going to say, you know, const title and complete is equal to to, and we're going to return all of this stuff. And now what I'm going to do inside of here is in this map, I'm simply, I can remove the squiggly brackets because we're just going to be returning the first thing that's in here. I'm going to return the to-do card, and I'm going to pass in to-do equals to-do as a prop, and I'm going to write self-closing tags here. So you can see here, for every single to-do, I am mapping through it, and I'm calling the to-do card, and I'm passing in the state variable called to-do, and that is getting passed in as a prop, and we're importing a to-do card. So we can see here, it looks like we're getting a bit of an error. So it looks like we're not passing in the things correctly. So let's go ahead and debug. Console.log to-do. So first of all, I'm pretty sure, right. So what we forgot to do was we forgot to take this as props and destructure it. Destructure to do from here. So const to do equals props. And we can go ahead and destructure that. And there we go. As we can see, it's completely added the title and the completed from all the to-dos here. Now, one thing I want to do is I want to limit the amount of to-dos we're actually displaying here. The reason I'm doing that is because this is like the fifth re-recording I've had to do, because anytime I write something and there's an error, even if it's like a syntax error, because I guess there's 200 to-dos, codesandbox.io doesn't really handle it very well, and it causes my entire browser to freeze. So I'm going to limit this to 10 to-dos. That way, if anything goes wrong, the whole thing doesn't freeze and I don't have to restart it. And the way I'm going to do that is right before the to-dos.map, I'm going to use something called a slice function. And what this will allow me to do is to have a start and an end index in my array that I want to limit the array to. So as you can see, now we only have 10 to-dos to work with here. That way we're not, you know, getting completely overloaded and my code sandbox isn't freezing. every 10 seconds. So let's go ahead now, and what I could do is another cool little thing I can do here is I can maybe add some style to each one of these divs. So I haven't touched upon CSS when it comes to React yet, and that is because I have a whole series on Material UI where I go over how to embed CSS and stuff like that. One way is to use Material UI and embed your CSS there, but we're just going to use the inline way of embedding CSS, and that is just going to look like style equals, and then you're going to have two squiggly braces, and then whatever CSS properties you want to have, you put it in here. Now, the main difference in having CSS names in inline styles inside of JSX versus in a CSS files is everything is camel case. So for example, in CSX you would have like text dash align and then the value for it. But in when you're doing it inline, it would be text align in camel case. So that's one thing to keep in mind. So I can say, for example, background color and set this equal to like you know, gray or something like that, and let's see how that affects it. You can see each one of these, and this looks super ugly, but I just want to do it so that it illustrates you know, each individual card. And let's maybe give each card, you know, a margin of like 10 pixels, and maybe a padding of like 10 pixels as well, just so it doesn't look like completely obnoxiously bad. So let's go ahead and okay, so this looks a tiny bit better. Maybe 15 padding was a bit too much. But yeah, we can also give it, I guess, a width of like, let's say for example, I don't know, is 50 pixels too small? Let's try that out. Oops. Yep, 50 pixels way too small, so let's give it a width of like 150 pixels. Okay, so you can see each to-do here is like sort of styled. Let's just keep it like that. And over here in this div, I'm gonna make this div style a flex. Display flex, so things will display side by side beside each other. And we can go ahead, and I think there's a property. So when you're looking at CSS, one thing I like to do is I like to inspect element, and I like to go ahead and select the thing that I want to inspect. And the font might be a bit too small to see here, but over here, when you have the div that you want to style selected, you can see that there's this thing called element.style, and you can go ahead and you can play around with different adding different CSS properties to see how it'll look. That way it speeds up the process. You don't have to type it in here, refresh the whole page and see if it worked or not. You could just, you know, for example, flex. I know there's a flex, I think a flex wrap, so we want flex wrap to be wrap. So that's the style I'm looking for. I want it to sort of look like that, so I'm going to come over here and say flex wrap is going to be wrap. And if I go ahead and refresh the page, you can see our to-dos are just showing up sort of side by side, and it'll sort of scale to the size of our browser. So let's go ahead and minimize that again. Okay, so now we have the to-dos displaying. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to be able to, when I click on that to-do, I want it to be able to go to our endpoint that we set up at the beginning of this video, that is /to-do/ the ID of it. So what I'm going to do is on our to-do card, I am going to pretty much, so there's a couple of different ways to do it, but what I want to do is I want to add an onClick to the overall div, and I can say onClick equals, and the onClick function I want to give to it is just a history.push. And our history, we don't have it imported yet, but it essentially what we can also go ahead and destructure the ID from our to-do, and essentially what we're going to do is history.push, and then we're going to push to /to-do/ and then our ID itself. So now let's go ahead and there's multiple different ways that we can import history, but I think React router DOM history hook, I think there's a hook that allows us to import history that we went over, and that is the use history hook. So we can go ahead and import our use history hook from React router DOM. Without this use history hook, to actually get history into your component to use the history.push function, I think I talked about it a bit in the last video. It was a bit of a mission, but we don't have to go through any of that. So now here we go. So let's go ahead and bring this up. So this is the first to do, and if I were to click on this, you can see here we are now going to /to-do/1. If I were to go back and click on this to do, it would be /to-do/10. So now we have everything we need in our other component to go ahead and import to go ahead and actually make the API request to get the details of that to-do. So let's go back to our to-do. So now what we want to do is we want to have a similar useEffect to the one that we had here. So let's go ahead and copy the state variable and the useEffect, and let's modify it a bit. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say, to-do details, and set to-do details is equal to useState. Same way that we were doing before. Let's go ahead and import useState into this component. State. Okay, and now what we are going to do is and we also need to import our useEffect, and let's import Axios as well. Now what we are going to do is we're going to simply do the same thing, except over here in our Axios request, if you remember, we are going to pass in /todos and then the ID to get just that specific to-dos information. So to-do / the ID, just like that, we're going to use string interpolation to pass in the ID that we earlier got from the use params hook to get that information. And then once we get the response, we can name it something like response to do. We can go ahead and set the to-do details equal to the response to do, just like that. So now if I were to go ahead and console.log the to do details after clicking on one of these to-dos, so let's go ahead and first of all refresh our console and click this, you'll see here that bam. At first it's undefined because, like we talked about before, it has to make the API request, but now we have all the information in our to-do. So now let's go ahead and start displaying some of the to-dos information in our render function. So for example, let's go ahead and destructure everything from our to-do details. So const like the ID, what else do we have here? The ID, user ID, title, and completed. ID, user ID, title, completed is going to be equal to our to-do details. Now note that our to-do details is going to be, and also we have two different IDs that are conflicting here. So one is the ID here and one is the ID that we're destructuring. Now the ID is going to be the same either way because we're getting the to-do based on this ID, but we can go ahead and call this like to-do ID or something like that, so we don't have any problem with this destructuring. And we can go ahead and now what we're going to do is these details are all going to be undefined at first while this to-do details is undefined. So for example, if I were to, let's say for example, have our div, and then inside of our div, in like h1, like let's say to-do ID, let's pass in the like to-do ID. And let's make sure we actually close these divs and make closing tags for our h1. Okay, so for example, we have to-do ID is this. This initially, I refreshed the whole page. As I was saying, this initially will show up as undefined here because our to-do details is still undefined before this API request is actually made. So one thing we can do is we can either initialize it to a blank object so that when this when it tries to get these attributes out of it, it will pretty much just be trying to pull something out of an empty map and initialize all of these to undefined. Or instead of doing that, you can make it equal to to-do or an empty map. So if to-do is undefined, it'll try to pull it from an empty map. Now, there's also going to be a point in time where you won't be able to see it. Oh, you might be able to get a glimpse of it right there, where it shows undefined before it shows 1. And that is because this is going to be undefined before this request is actually done. So what we can do is that same logic that we had before, where we say, to-do details. So if the to-do details is rendered or not, then if it's rendered, we can go ahead and display all this stuff in here that we wanted to display. So let's go ahead and make a div and display it in here. But if it is undefined, we can go ahead and once again get our circular progress. And here we go. So for the split second that to-do is undefined, and obviously now it's it's not going to show, but for the split second that to-do details is undefined, it will actually display our loading bar. That way you don't have anything weird where it shows a big undefined and then goes to 1, because that's a lot more noticeable. And yeah, so we can go ahead, to-do ID, and let's just go ahead and fill in the rest of the data. So to-do ID, to-do user ID, it's just going to be the user ID. The to-do title is just going to be the title. And then finally completed is just going to be completed. And there you are. You can see we have an application where I can go to the base of the application. I can go ahead and it will load a bunch of these to-do. I can click on any of these to-dos and it will load the information. There we go. We saw the to-do loading thing nicely, and it will load all this information. That is pretty much it. That is using everything that we've learned thus far. And this you will see in real applications. You won't be making the, a lot of the times you won't actually be making these API requests just straight up in your React application. You're going to be making it in, not in your component. You're going to be making it in something called, for example, a Redux Saga, which is separate from your JSX. And we're not just going to be calling any random endpoint. We're probably going to be calling one from our backend. And it's very important that you don't, make database API calls or anything like that straight from your component, because anyone that uses your site can see all the requests that are outgoing from your browser. So they'll be able to see, the URL to your database. If you're authenticating, they'll be able to see, your authentication to your database, etc., etc. So in the next couple of videos, we're going to talk more about Redux. We're going to talk more about state management, Redux Saga. We might get into things like creating a very simple Express application to make your own endpoint and stuff like that. And then hopefully in a future project, we'll be able to make this to-do app where we can actually have our to-dos in our own database, and we can actually, create to-dos and pull the to-dos from our database and our backend using React, and then actually deploy the application. And that's really where I'm going with this course, so stay tuned for that. And if you found value in this video, please consider leaving a comment, liking, subscribing. I read every single comment, and I can't tell you how much it helps with the YouTube algorithm to get my videos out there to more people. So thanks again. I hope you're all staying safe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.